Welcome back to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm your host, Ann Snyder, and as you all know, we have been lingering in these summer months around friendship, both beholding its timeless grace and interrogating its more contemporary cast. Today, I want to reflect on what it might require to prioritize friendship in an organizational context, specifically one that exists to cultivate wholeness in people and institutions for the broader transformation of communities. Laity Lodge in the Texas Hill Country is a remarkable place. I like to think of it as a kind of Rivendell brought to life for wayfarers of all stripes to stop for a spell and reacquaint themselves with the logic of God, with the mysterious grace of sacred realities. The lodge is supported by a foundation, the H.E. Butt Foundation, which oversees it and other initiatives sprinkled throughout some 1,900 acres along a really beautiful stretch of the Frio River Canyon. A youth camp, a family camp, an outdoor school, and a camp that provides free facility use to qualifying groups. There is a lot I could say about the H.E. Butt Foundation and just its patient listening to the human and ecological cries of our time, and then its generous brilliance to serve and provide space for those cries to be transformed into inspired action in the world. But perhaps the simplest thing to say is that it is a place that understands the relational nature of reality. A place that understands how radical hospitality can awaken a person, dulled by the strains and fragments of modern life, awaken them to love with freedom and joy all over again. A place that understands the role of silence and beauty and excellence and all five of our senses. A place that honors friendship and rings and layers of friendship as a gift worth investing in, because it may just echo God's desire to be friends with us. I invited the president of the H.E. Butt Foundation, David Rogers, and the director of Laity Lodge, Steven Purcell, onto this podcast to try to put some words to the wisdom they have gleaned over the years, stewarding a mission that recenters and recharges all who are woven into it. David, Steven, it's lovely to see you both, albeit virtually, and have you on the Whole Person Revolution today. Welcome.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you. That was a beautiful introduction. I hope we can add to that with our personal stories, but that was beautiful. Thank you.
I have long found that the Frio River Canyon is just one of those rare places where recovery of the sacred happens time and again, and where great transformation can happen, whether in your own soul, in your mind, in a relationship between a visiting guest or a camper and God, in a relationship with a paradigm that you once held that now suddenly feels dull and too constricting. And I think one of the beauties of the H.E. Butt Foundation and stewarding all this is its respect for the mystery of human transformation. You know, you guys would never turn anything into a formula, but I do wonder if you could at least describe some of the key conditions that you believe have to be in place to create hospitable soil for people's unique journeys to be set in motion. Like, what are the ingredients you work so hard to tend and preserve and sometimes improve?
I think there's a lot of things that we're always trying to pay attention to be sensitive to in terms of how to receive a guest or to set up a weekend. As you know, Anne, there's something that we say at the beginning of just about every retreat, which I think in a pretty simple statement captures a lot of what we're trying to do. And that is, on the first night of a retreat, whoever's hosting will say this, that we have an agenda, but we don't have an agenda for you. And I think that statement actually accomplishes or is trying to say an awful lot. It's there's many layers to it. But in a really basic sense, I think one of the things it's trying to say is when we have an agenda, it's saying that we have prepared. There's been a lot of thought that's gone into this weekend. We're ready for you. If you have questions about whether or not you're going to be comfortable, you can begin to relax because we've anticipated a lot of the needs that you bring to this weekend or to this retreat. But then when we follow it by saying, but we don't have an agenda for you, I think it's a way of saying that that we don't have an agenda for what this weekend needs to mean for you. That the weekend itself is somehow a gift that we're trying to offer. And in light of that, you can receive the gift that's on offer, or you don't have to. But that we don't have a kind of an angle that we're trying to work. We're not trying to reach any sort of a conclusion with you or to shape your thinking along any particular contours, but that we're just here to be together and to be available. But I think that there's something in that is important, because to say that you don't have an agenda for someone hopefully creates or begins to create the condition of trust, that a person can feel like they are safe to let their guard down if they don't feel like there's something that you're trying to get across with them. So I think that's one of the mantras that we all sort of live by, that I think is reflective of kind of the culture of Laity Lodge.
Very well said. David, you oversee such a broad brush of all this. How would you reflect on sort of key ingredients you've discovered over time?
Well, I think at Laity Lodge, which was built in 1961, Mrs. Butt Sr. built the lodge that holds about 60 to 65 people at its prime. And she wanted to build the nicest living room in the Texas Hill Country. So it was never meant to be a conference center. It was meant to be come to our home, come and refresh here in this beautiful piece of property. So from the very beginning, and when she started working with the architects, set that up to be a very welcoming place. Sit down, and there's a big fireplace at the front of the room, and big, beautiful glass windows overlooking the Frio River. That goes all the way back to the beginning. You mentioned the other parts of the camp, youth camp. This is a place where we hear our kids say, I can be myself. And as we know where our society is right now, that the authentic self is not something that we expose very much. But these kids are able to do that there. And that's where some of their friendships grow and prosper. And I think we see that quite a bit. Well, we see it all the time.
So, David, you mentioned Mary, your father-in-law, Howard Butt Jr., who really developed the early days of Laity Lodge, as you say, in the 60s, began facilitating gatherings some decades ago that encouraged kind of a unique combination of vulnerability in the context of people gathered to reflect on their own leadership and sort of everyday human action in secular domains. And this was, as I understand it, quite before what some of us would know as like this world of faith and work and all those conversations. This was quite ahead of that time. And in all of this, he would gather fairly significant people who would be considered influential in a worldly sense. One aspect of his kind of intuitive genius, as I would call it, seemed to be that you needed to invest in friendship itself first, or at least invest in the conditions in which they get baked. How did Howard, and in many ways ever since, the whole culture of the foundation come to see the world and God's action in the world so relationally?
I think that's a very good question. It points me to actually go back to his parents, my wife's grandparents, Howard Butt Sr. He would write his wife letters at different stages of their life. And we have a letter that he wrote on his 40th birthday and was kind of this is what I want to do for the next 20 years. And so I'm going to read you a sentence. It says, to not lose sight of my duty to God and my fellow man, enlarging constantly as my position warrants on our charitable and community work, taking care to develop this side above all others. And he ends that to have closer relationships and a better understanding of the problems of my employees and my associates. So I think that goes back to an anchor in the family that relationships matter. I know with Howard, relationships trumped just about everything. Mm-hmm. And when we would work on programs that were more nationally based, and he would work with men and women of faith in very high positions around the country, he would have to ease them into understanding the ethos of what Laity Lodge is and how that relational piece, when you bring people together, is what begins to open people up to those vulnerabilities that then allow people to say, I have something in common with you.
I think one of the things about the Lodge history is to understand that when the Lodge was launched in 1961, it came through a family and through an individual who had significant agency and power and financial assets and already had a reputation. But he was also deeply affected by his own limitations around challenges with mental health and clinical depression. So in the late 50s, early 60s, well before certainly people of faith in the South were talking about these challenges and struggles, Howard didn't have a choice, in a sense. They were so present and real in his life, and he had his own breakdowns, that he somehow, I think by God's grace, made the decision that he was going to lead with sort of a level of transparency about those realities. So he had the strength and the stature, but he also had, he possessed real openness and transparency about his own brokenness and his own struggles. And so when they built the lodge in the early days, the act of storytelling and of vulnerability was baked into the very, very beginnings of the lodge. And I think it characterized what the lodge would become, even if it took different shapes or different emphases in the decades to follow. Nevertheless, from the very beginning, there was this value of showing up with excellence, but also with transparency and a real sense of sober humility about your own struggles. And so I think that's an important part of our history that not everybody knows, but those of us who work there know that that's where we all began. And in some ways, that's where the power lies.
The foundation has always been, or at least as I've known it, has been a sort of sociologically diverse organization, particularly pertaining to social class. And I'd just be curious, how have you watched relationships between colleagues who may come from different social classes and live in different zip codes and all of that? What is that journey like? How for an organization that really believes in the dignity of all and to honor that dignity in every person and support their role in their work, if you could just describe those dynamics a bit, I think that would be really interesting.
Howard Butt passed away, what was it, David, almost 6 years ago? And shortly after he passed, we had an all-staff meeting scheduled. So all 120 plus people in the organization were going to be meeting out on the foundation property. And we kind of impulsively, or in a moment, sort of shifted our agenda to basically be a bit of a memorial time for everyone just to reflect. And it was interesting when we basically kind of passed the mic and just allowed people to reflect on their memories of Howard Butt. What was absolutely striking and moving was how many people up and down and around the organization, completely regardless of their station in life or their job, referred to how personally they felt seen and treated by Howard Butt, to the point that he knew their children's names, he knew something about them, or he would at least ask. And it's something about the DNA of the organization that is there and that the rest of us, I think, have to kind of work at, to kind of keep up with, or to try to live into. But there's a personalness at the heart of the organization, by virtue of its leaders, that is quite powerful.
Anytime I've been to the canyon, I'm always surprised at how just the power of the place itself somehow takes over. And that can be emotional. It can be very imagination expanding. It can, of course, be full of stillness and just like attentive to these deeper realities that are always part of our lives, but somehow we allow so many distractions. When we talk about friendship, a lot of us talk about shared interests and ideas and questions. And of course, as you go through life, being there for one another in times of suffering and all of that. But there's something about the power of place, I think, that I've watched in the canyon birth and sustain a unique degree of just shared context. Can either of you pontificate a little bit on the power of place in friendships?
This is a question worthy of a dissertation answer. But I think one of the things that is that we're aware of, and I've been helped in my appreciation of this by our friend Mary Earle, but there is a little bit of a pilgrimage experience that a person has to even show up at the lodge. I mean, we're kind of stuck in the middle of nowhere. It's 2 hours from San Antonio. And so for most people, it's even several hours beyond that, or even it involves a flight. So there is this effort required to get there. Mm-hmm. But once you arrive at the lodge, you're sort of driving down these asphalt highways at 75 miles per hour. But then you have to turn aside onto this caliche dirt road that goes down and down and down into a bottom of a canyon. And then you're sort of unbelievably asked to literally drive through a river, not just over a river, but turn the wheels of your car into a river. There's no other way to get anywhere in the canyon but to have this crazy experience of driving through a river. And then you pull out of it and you're surrounded by these canyon walls. And I think the thing that my friend Mary mentions is that just by virtue of arriving, you're kind of reminded of your own finitude, of your own scale, that you are so small in comparison to this place and to your surroundings, which is probably a necessary ingredient to maybe get to the bottom of things. So that before anyone on staff has said a word or done anything that has any kind of programmatic intent, the place has already conditioned the guest to toward some humility, toward some openness, to a right-sized sense of scale about how small I am within this world. But then to be greeted with kind of love and care and attention to detail. I just think some powerful things begin to happen before any note or word of curriculum or a big idea is spoken. The place is doing its work on people.
That's a beautiful story, and I think he's absolutely right. From the question, you took me to an actual experience this summer with a family that I had at Laity Lodge. There's this family that has 4 daughters that from Washington, D.C. The mom grew up in the camps. My wife was her counselor. So Deborah was her counselor back in however many years ago. And this was her last time to bring her last year to be at camp. And so we were just reminiscing around the table about how many trunks that she had to put on an airplane from Washington, D.C. in all those years. Well, here were the connections that happened in a 20-minute period. The oldest daughter and my daughter were in camp together their first year. and they were in the same session every year and were roommates at Baylor when they went off to school. So that was a relationship that started in the first little cabin at Singing Hills. As we were sitting at the table, a friend from Nashville came over and said, "Melissa, what are you doing here?" So this friend from Nashville was a good friend of Melissa's sister, and they had some time to visit. A friend of ours then came and sat at the table from Austin, and we introduced them to this family from D.C. And once they said, "Well, wait, what's your maiden name?" "Oh," she said, 40 years ago, we were on work crew together. So they were on staff together. And that happened then. Our chef from Laity Lodge came out to meet the family and said, "Oh yes, your middle daughter was when I was working in the youth camp as the food service person, she was a cook for me." So in a 20-minute period, there were 5 connections to that one family, not from Texas, but from Washington, D.C. So I tell you that it just kind of floored me that, wow, these are the kind of things that happen out here. And we don't even know the depth of them, of where relationships get started at a place like our camps and retreat center.
Yeah. And there's it's layer upon layer of friendship, and then all of these layers of shared experience. Stephen, as director of Laity Lodge, I, over the years, have noticed you speak very naturally in the language of friends. You just said, I think you said, "Our friend Mary Earl." Mm-hmm. And that's kind of just a part of the way that you honor people. Your friends seem to be relationships that you at once treasure and protect. And then when appropriate, given your role where you're helping to curate a particular retreat and populate it with certain kinds of musicians and speakers and so on, you think about sharing these friendships with a broader world at appropriate junctures. Maybe I observe this because in my own role as a magazine editor, who's trying to find people to populate a given issue, I do something a little bit similar. Friends are considered part of your vocation, as part of the soup that you make week to week from retreat to retreat. Yeah. How do you understand this word friend or friendship in sort of that vocational context versus, say, the fellow parishioner at your local church, or your neighbor, physical neighbor in your neighborhood, or someone from childhood you've known forever, but you wouldn't necessarily ask them to speak at a retreat? How do you negotiate all of this, given the sort of deep humanity, but I would also think spiritual rigor of your role?
Oh man, that's such an interesting question, and feels kind of delicate to think about. Of course, there's all kinds of relationships that any of us have, like you've just referred to. But you're right. And it's actually been pointed out to me before that I think we sometimes invoke language of friendship with a degree of frequency that is maybe notable. I think I probably have my own unconscious reasons for doing it. I think what is perhaps worth reflecting on is that one of the qualities or the values that I think is most important to us is this idea of trust, or of trustworthiness. And I wonder if by invoking or using language of friendship in the context of kind of my vocation of what I do at the lodge is a way of signaling that this is not just someone we know, or someone who's very smart or clever or could impress you. But if we're operating in a context of friendship, I think what we are trying to say or signal is that this is someone you can trust. And it's imperfect, of course, because all of us are not always worthy of trust. But as best we're able, in good faith, I think we tend to operate in an environment in which trust is our most important asset. And so when a group of people step into the Great Hall and I stand up the front and refer to this person as a friend, I think what I'm trying to say is not that I just have a relationship with this person, but that this is someone who I trust. And I hope, therefore, that you will afford them or give them the gift of your own openness. And that's where it feels delicate and precarious at times, if I'm honest. I think, I don't know if this is necessary to say, but I think one of the other things I would maybe offer is that anybody's presence in a retreat like that is not just because they are mine, Steven's friend, but every time there is someone who is invited, there is a personal dimension to it, but there's also the institutional. It has to be the right fit for the room, for the institution, for the lodge, and not just for me.
Right.
So there's a discernment process around the invitation of these friends or these individuals that involves a conversation with my colleagues about, at this particular time in history, at this season, at this moment, given this theme, given this audience that we expect to be in the room, who's the right person? But all of that is going toward hopefully being worthy of people's trust at a given weekend, not because we feel like we're wanting to really achieve any other particular goal.
Right.
I want to tell an interesting story that I heard last week. So we just finished camp, and this mother came up and said, "Hey, I just want you to I want to tell you how much my two boys loved camp." We weren't sure, it was their first time to come, how it was going to go. We knew one of them was going to do fine. He's an extrovert. And we have another one that's, just not quite, we weren't sure how that was going to go. And she made the point of saying, and when we came to pick him up, he introduced us to people in his cabin. And with each one, he said, "Mom, this is my good friend, John. Mom, this is my good friend." And she, the mom, picked up on, I've never heard him say good friend. Mm. And so something in that couple of weeks gave him that impression that this is where you make good friends. We have our values in our organization, but we also have what we call our anchors. We are rooted in our Christian faith. Our programs create opportunities for people to encounter God through these 4 anchors. And one of them is relationships. And here's the subtitle under it. We work to facilitate connections for people to really know and be known by one another. So all the things that we try to do, whether it's just kind of part of our DNA, that with every activity we do with the camps, with every activity we do at Laity Lodge, we are facilitating a way for people to have connections, to really know and be known by one another. He's my good friend.
Everyone at the foundation, regardless of their role, whether it's cooking or cleaning or directing a retreat or tending to artists or welcoming people when they arrive or designing activities for kids, you're all uniquely involved in setting the conditions for encounters, holy encounters to occur with one to another, with the land, and perhaps with God himself. And this is like very special work. I loved the word delicate that you used, Steven. And nothing about it is transactional, or it shouldn't be. And yet we're all human and we're limited creatures. And I just would love to know, as you have now been at this a little while in your respective roles, stewarding a mission that is in some ways trying to create a bit of magic for everyone that passes through. Could you share some of the rhythms you found that help keep you in this for the long haul, that keep you marveling at human beings as end in themselves, to avoid the risk of your own work and service becoming transactional?
There was someone who was speaking at a retreat just this summer, John Swinton, who does a lot of work in the area of disability. And he said a lot of amazing things. But the one thing that he said that just sort of pierced me is when he said, there need to be times in our lives when we are the host, but there also need to be times when we are the guest. And speaking personally, I'm probably much more accustomed at exercising the muscles of that first category than the second. So as both of you know, I've just returned from some experiences that allowed for me to be a guest. And I think I was actually shocked and kind of struck by how much I needed it and how healing it was in sort of restoring. So I don't know how to, I don't think I have a great answer about how I've maintained sort of healthy balances in my own life. But one thing I will say is that you said something about magic and these trying to create the conditions for these experiences that inevitably are very special to people. And I would say that one of the ways that we approach our work, and I think this is true across the canyon, it's certainly true of the folks at the lodge, is that I don't feel like we are consciously trying to ever create any kind of a climax experience or even a mountaintop experience. We're trying to create the conditions for pretty normal stuff to happen. Conditions for people to eat together, to pray together, to learn together, to laugh, cry, to make things, to rest, to sleep, all of these things that should be fairly normal. We just try to do it extremely well in a concentrated period of time when you don't have to fix the meal or clean up afterwards, right? So when there is an experience that seems like a mountaintop experience, or where some kind of magic takes place, I'd like to think that we have some kind of a healthy detachment for feeling responsible for any of it, if that makes sense. Our own rhythms, internal rhythms, are not connected to whether or not we reach some sort of a summit together. So we're not coming down maybe off of the same peaks that some of the guests are. We have a certain, like I said, level of detachment from not where a retreat will go, but maybe it's as much a surprise to us as it is to any of the guests in the room.
Yes.
And I suppose that does, there's a certain fatigue that can result from that, but we're not dealing with disappointment or deep longing that it's going to be something that you might expect. There's just a kind of a stepping into a routine that is has been kind of tried and tested over time.
David, you've somehow found a way, and you perhaps inherited it from your father-in-law, Howard, to, as we've sort of been talking about, foster this broader culture of friendship within the foundation. And a lot of organizational leaders tune in to this podcast. Could you name some practices or principles you've learned along the way that might encourage them to cultivate a culture of friendship inside their own institutions?
Well, let me start here. I borrowed a saying from someone that speaks at Laity Lodge. Messed up people mess up organizations. Messed up organizations can mess up people. However, healthy people can contribute to healthy organizations, and healthy organizations can contribute to healthy people. So I try as a leader and as a person to make sure our place of work has healthy rhythms, all the things we've been talking about Laity Lodge. And I know there's some people that have come to this organization and they've been hurting so much, and their time with us has felt this has been a healing place. Yes, I'm working, but this has been a healing place. So that's an organization that has helped that person. I love what I do. I love the work. I love the people. I try to be a friend of theirs. I know I'm the boss, but I try to learn about their family. when they ask me to do something in the youth camp that's not quite up my alley, I say, yes, I'll go and do that with you guys. So they see the real David. I manage by walking around and stopping in people's offices and just without an agenda, just try to see what's going on in their lives and in their work. And generally something very important comes up. And I'm vulnerable and I share my failures, probably more than I should sometimes. But I do think that's human, and it's the truth. So, we just do the best we can.
It's quite a thing to listen to your boss sort of describe himself at length like that, and to know that there wasn't a false note in it. He knows, I think he's comfortable with himself. He's comfortable in his own skin. And there is there's something in that makes you want to follow it. So it was just, it's great to hear him reflect and talk out loud, and it's all true.
Well, it's a real grace. Thank you both so much. Just even the tone of your vocals in this conversation, let alone what you have said, it just rings of the gentleness and authenticity and I think just receptivity to a lifelong journey we're all on of sort of seeking the wisdom of things and the reality of things. So thank you for modeling that with me and our listeners, and of course for your friendship to me over all these years. May it not ever end.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you, Anne.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Whole Person Revolution podcast, which is as much a cultural compass for comment as it is an incarnate witness of the hope we explore in our pages. Like what you heard? Check out this podcast's intellectual seedbed at www.comment.org, where you'll find an artistic rendering of essays that shed light on the very real shadows afflicting the peace of our commons today, but also the many cracks of light. And consider joining us. You can write, you can read, you can host a comment supper in your neighborhood, or you can suggest questions that are pressing upon your desire to be an agent of grace and truth and gentleness and trustworthiness. We want to hear from you, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at comment@cardis.ca and expect a sincere exchange. We're honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comet Magazine, produced and with original music by Allie Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder, and I'll see you next week.